Jesus said you're going to hear about wars, reports wars, right?
Right. Like all of
See,
history.
see
Hmm.
that, yeah,
Yeah.
all through history.
Hmm.
He said, see that you're not alarmed,
Hmm.
for these things must take place, but the end is not yet. Okay?
Hmm.
So now, Jesus, in answering their question here, he's going to be answering their question about the temple, and he's going to be answering the question about his presence or his coming, his future coming.
Well,
See, because they wouldn't be talking about his.
that's
That's another subject.
yeah.
That is another
Um,
subject.
uh, do you think that coming of Jehovah was talked about in the Old Testament? Was there any comings where he comes? Is that a good thing or kind of a usually connected with judgment? Like sometimes it's called the day of Yahweh or the day of Jehovah or
Mm-hmm.
Jehovah is coming. And that might be interesting to look up in the Old Testament because this is not the only coming, but now there was comings of Jehovah in the Old Testament. Now Jesus is talking about the sign of his coming. And it's interesting
Okay.
because the Old Testament uses the same words, comings
You're
of
right.
Jehovah, of judgment, really bad judgments. And this is what he's talking about, not a future thing, in 2010 or 2020 or whatever. He's still talking about the same thing. The coming of Jehovah to them is really not going to be good. The end of the
That's
age.
right.
The end of
You're
the
right.
age.
You're right.
So
That's
I
right.
don't see
So
now
it's
in their
future, right?
future to
It's still
them.
future.
No,
Yeah.
this
Mm-hmm.
was future to them at the time. That's how,
That's right.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
And
no,
this
I
is
don't
future
see,
to us at the time.
yeah, no, I don't see it that way, but I see it as,
Well, anyway, that's another subject too. So let's just see what Jesus was
okay,
trying to
okay,
tell them so you can get your other question answered,
okay,
okay?
sounds good.
But now he says you're going to hear wars, you're going to hear reports of wars, but the end's not yet. Well, there has always been wars. I mean, even in Bible times and even before that. I
Right,
mean, there was wars even back when they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden because they were against each other,
right,
okay?
right. Hmm.
Okay. So now he says, so, but the end's not yet. But now in verse 7, he's telling us something special now
Hmm.
is going to happen in regard to wars. So would you like to read that,
For
verse
nation shall
7?
rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows.
Okay. Now, God wants us to use our senses. He wants us to use what he gave us, to stop and think about what he's talking about. So now this verse is different from verse 6. Verse 7 talks about nations rising against each other, kingdoms rising against each other. When did that happen in history?
It's happened all through history.
Pardon?
It's happened all through history.
No. Wars and reports of wars have. But when was the first time that whole nations and whole kingdoms all over fought?
Well, this isn't necessarily describing a world war. It just says nations will rise
Yeah.
against nations. I mean, that's what a war is. It's a nation against a nation. And there was actually world wars before World War One and after World War One. And just because
Okay,
it's
there you
called
go.
World War, it's not really, it wasn't really the whole world.
Well, how much was it then, honey?
I'd have to look it up.
Well, it was about 94, 95% of the whole world was involved in it, one way or another. They might not have been in the actual fighting, but they were in the background supporting. So that's what history tells us. So
Okay.
Jesus is telling us in this verse that this is different from the previous verse. Because remember, he said you're going to hear wars and reports of wars. End is not yet. But then he differentiates that, and then he says, but nation, when it rises against nation, food shortages, earthquakes, and so forth, he says this is just a beginning a beginning of pains. See? So the beginning, if you go back in history and you check, it has been different since World War I than it has ever been in history before. That's why they called it World War I, because the whole world had never been affected in that way before. As a result of the war, of course, they had the pestilences, they had the earthquakes, food shortages. Luke adds pestilences, and that was the Spanish flu, if you remember, from 1914 to 1918. So this was different than any other time in history, and that was what Jesus was telling them.
He was talking about World War I?
Yes, ma'am. He had to be. You go back and you think about it. Well, first fulfillment was, like you mentioned, in 70 for that Jewish system. But see, that question they asked him past that Jewish system, it passed the sign when he would come or when he would be present in his power, in the power that God had given to him as a king. So when you think about that, when you do this extra research, you'll find out that things have been different since the year 1914. In fact, in history, if you go back and you read about 1913, they thought they had peace. They thought the world was in peace, and they were just proclaiming it and everywhere. And then all at once, in 1914, the war started with one single shot, and it went throughout for the whole world to take sides in that war and to become a part of it. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, I don't think Jesus is talking about World War I. I think it's a really unique teaching that the society developed after Russell's failed predictions. Do you know what the things he predicted for 1914 were?
Yes, but you tell me
Well,
what you found.
In his books, he said it would be the end of Armageddon, the end of Christendom, the end of all governments, and the beginning of paradise.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's the way they felt back then.
No, he didn't feel that. He wasn't a person, just an individual who felt that. He taught it the world over. And not only that, he said they were God's dates, not his. And he said if you don't go along with his new light, you'll be left behind, and etc., things like that. So, we don't want to reinterpret it to some felt, right? This was...
Well, he felt that way, and that's what he taught. That's
yes,
what I'm saying.
Taught dogmatically that way.
He taught that.
Yes.
He did.
As though he was speaking from some kind of authority. He felt, they defined him later as the seventh and final messenger of the church, the Laodicean messenger. So, let's not say he just felt that way or some felt that way. So I think they focused on World War I after, because it just happened to have its kind of official beginning in 1914. But he wasn't predicting a world war, so it's not. He believed the last days began in, I don't know, at first it was 1799, and then he changed it to 1874 or something like that, so he believed Jesus already. Well, no, 1874 was when he believed Jesus was present since 1874, and they taught that for a long time, even after World War I. So they sure didn't recognize it as that.
But then they changed their thinking later, right?
Yes, because they couldn't sustain the false predictions anymore.
Why did they change their thinking later?
Far later.
Why did that thinking change later?
Well, because it wasn't working out. Their dates and everything wasn't working out. They had to change it to explain
So they had to go back and
1914.
do more research, right?
No, they had to change it because they had to give some kind of explanation for all his false predictions for 1914. And then instead of it being these majorly apocalyptic visible things, they just changed it to invisible, which was something that had been done before them as well by Ellen G. White. She did the same thing for 1844, which she was into following William Miller. So I think that's where he learned, they learned to do that, just reinterpret as being invisible. So they still kept that date. So yeah, that's why, not research, but to somehow try to, um, deal with that. Because, theologians and scholars just said he was a false prophet.
Well, they have never, in my reading and studying,
Mm-hmm.
none of them have ever said they're infallible, like the
Oh,
Pope
yes, they
does.
do. They say it all the time. They've even said it recently, like on this broadcasting where they showed, I think it was the annual meeting or something like that. They showed a lady all their books from the past that they would use for Bible studies, and they put on the video a lady saying, this book was from God. And when you say things like that, that's what inspiration means. And for many years, they use, just, you can use words that mean the same thing, right? And say, oh well, we never said we were inspired, but you're saying it's from Jehovah. We're the channel. It's meat in due season from Jehovah. You can't find the truth without this channel, right? The one guy in the broadcast said the direction comes from Jehovah to Jesus to them. And they've always said that.
Mm-hmm.
They've always said inspiration claims without actually saying the word, right?
Okay.
If you think about it.
So they're trying to let God direct them in the best way that they can. That is true. They are trying to do that. But this is something that I have always seen, that if they did make a mistake, they would come back and they would change it and they would update it.
Yeah, because
and that's what I appreciate about it, because no one else updated it for them. They recognized it themselves.
Well,
and they updated the information.
yeah. Well, the Bible doesn't call that mistakes. When you speak at something in the name of Jehovah and it doesn't come to pass, in Old Testament times, that was a grounds for being executed. And that's how serious,
Okay.
They can't just go, sorry, it was just a mistake. We're just human. Well, their claim is far above being human. They're claiming a prophet-like status as being God's only channel on the whole earth that can help you understand the Bible. And they speak for God, is what they say. They liken themselves to Moses sometimes by saying, you'll be swallowed up in the earth like Korah if you don't listen to us. They use that as an analogy.